piston on it. Now there's also the urea engine and the bleach engine. Both of these are easy to process down from things that your body makes. Very cool. Although I recommend not doing it that way, it is very time consuming. However, you can go down and you can purchase the items yourself. Now, having the original 3-stage engine will not work. That's because each valve vents into another valve adjacent to it. It goes from the high pressure valve with, just a small volume of area, and then it goes to the medium pressure, which, is a larger volume of area. And then it goes to the low pressure, which is even larger. So each piston helps to push the next one. And that helps keep a reciprocating force going through it. Now there's 3 different chemical stages that I was learning about that are chemical processes, by which one chemical turns into another chemical through a chemical process or through electrolysis. And I was noticing that you can make an engine on based on that same concept. The reason for this is because you've got chlorates, perchlorates, hyperchlorates, chlorides, nitrates, sodiums and potassiums, and they enter your waste becomes the process by which your machine is actually going to run. Let me give you an example. And I'll do this without telling you the exact chemicals because any of you idiots could figure this out. Oh my God, any of you. All right, so you produce a certain type of gas, similar to if you were to take a lead acid battery and you put salt water on it, it starts immediately producing chlorine gas. Not only does it produce that chlorine gas, but it produces that chlorine gas under pressure. Another process by which this works is electrolysis. In the process of electrolysis, you've got a positive and a negative, basically a wire going in, and the positive, is it the positive ion or electron? I just watched this stuff and I'm still trying to learn it. Anyway, in water, you've got one side that takes off the hydrogen molecule, and the other side will take off the oxygen molecule. A lot of people do the either-or method. Well, we're going to just harvest the hydrogen, or we're just going to harvest the oxygen. You can harvest one of the chemicals that's a byproduct, and as long as you have a method by which you can exchange it, you can keep 3 separate chemical reactions going, one of them being a low pressure reaction, one of them being a medium pressure reaction, and one of them being a high pressure reaction. And the chemicals that are produced from each one and the byproducts produced by each one will help another stage to function. There's also the heat produced as waste in portions of it, and in one of the other methods, it's actually cooling that is created by it, which is very cool. So there's different ways of taking both of those thermal reactions and using them to produce power as well. You notice I'm saying power instead of energy. Yes, it's a release of energy. The release of energy creates the coldness, right? In a way of speaking. But also, how do you use that cold to make you run? Do you use a Peterson type engine, or possibly use a Van de Graaff generator to try to create your electrolysis? Or do you use a different combination of these different methods? Well, the one that I was just watching, this guy's showing me how he takes one chemical that's a potassium type and another chemical that's a sodium type attached to a nitrogen molecule. He's also showing how the chlorine gases work, the different types of chlorine gases, and also he's explaining how he's just trying to collect one part off of it. So that part he has go to the positive anode, and of course it's vented to a tube, and that tube takes it to his collection container. And the other side of it is vented. It's just vented out into the atmosphere. He was saying that the chemicals in that particular process aren't the ones that are extremely dangerous. That's the next step of the process. Salt water. And I didn't realize the salt water itself was so reactive. I knew that it was conductive, but reactive to the point where it could explode simply because it's got salt in it. That's a new one to me. And that's also a process by which one of the other chemicals that they were venting could be processed with other chemicals in order to, of course, make more hydrothermal, I think is the term that he used. It's the fact that it's a liquid and it has the chemical process going on in it, that it actually draws heat from the atmosphere, and that's where the ice around certain things forms. And I've been learning about a lot of these different processes, and the more I look at it, and the more this guy talked about it, and he was talking about the amount of waste that's made by each method, and also the fact that you could reduce that waste down to zero by making, there's a different method for each part that he's talking about. But he doesn't himself make the connection that he just explained a circulatory system based on nitrates. He also explained nearly a complete system based on bleach, and nearly a complete system based on urine. So with the chemical processes that he was explaining, though, he was talking about explosives versus inert chemicals. What is it that makes it an explosive versus making it inert? What is it that makes it an accelerant versus being inert? What's the difference between an accelerant and explosive? And although it's really cool that there's a lot of explosives and stuff in it, I mean, that's a lot of the stuff that you guys would get into. For me, it was the fact that these chemicals can actually be kept inert and basically use the process, the chemical processes, to recycle the parts that you're normally putting to waste. And since I was looking at it, I had to go through like 3 or 4 more times just to make sure I got it right. And yeah, his explanations are great. He also talked about some of the chemical processes, the heat that it produces, how much per mole, a whole bunch of stuff that is way, way over my head. Processes, and also looked them up in some of my survival mode. Now I know that a lot of you guys out there and a lot of you ladies out there have come up with a great idea, right? But you're constantly in a state of movement and survival. So your idea, it's not that it never comes to fruition. It's that you have to wait for 20 years to see it, and somebody else made it, and they're making the profits off of it, right? Well, here's an idea. Look up the sodium nitrate. Look up the chemical processes with that. Look up urine-powered battery. That's a really cool one. And also look what happens when you have a lead acid battery that is cracked and contaminated with salt water. Each of these different types of chemical processes you'll get to learn based on the coloration, whether or not it's working properly or correctly, and also the amount of saturation of different chemicals in each. One of the cool things about 2 of the chemicals is that they're self-stabilizing. So once you get a certain amount of saturation point, it's not going to accept any more of the other chemicals until it's released the other chemical that it's going to produce, allowing it to come back in. And I know I'm explaining it in a very complicated way because I'm not using any of the big science words, but I'm still trying to remember the chlorates, perchlorates, what's the other one? Complex hydrocarbons. That one's not so much to do with this situation, but it does have to do with a lot of the possibilities as far as charcoal filtering, which is a 4th process by which the man was explaining it. So basically, you could make an engine that's got 11 different possibilities or more just based on the chemical processes and whether or not you're willing to utilize the thermal processes as well. Rod 75 typed, I choose three-stage urine engine. The three-stage urine engine, oh my dear my. That one, I know that I haven't focused on that one. I've been focusing on the nitrates and the hypochlorides and stuff. But a lot of that can be processed out of urine in different methods, which is also really cool. But the urine-powered battery, I saw 3 different ones. One of them has a lithium composite. But the other two, they basically took a sheet of manganese, and they wrapped it around a core. And the core is a piece of graphite that goes down the center. Now around the graphite, there is a piece of copper. I think they were saying it was a copper alloy that they were using for the Texas. Is it Texas that has the big mining college or whatever? Texas A&M, is that it? All I know is they have a football team that's something. Anyway, they take this copper, and it's just a jacket, and it's got a little bit of space where there's space in between the jacket and the graphite in the center. And then they have this manganese that's wrapped around the outside of it. And then they've got the wire that's attached to the bottom on the outside of the manganese. And then they've got another wire that goes right down the center of the graphite. Now, because of the chemical reaction of the urine hitting it, it immediately starts producing a type of gas that is both poisonous and explosive. So that's probably something to look at. But it also, it's about as poisonous as using bleach to wipe down your counters or using ammonia to clean your bathroom. Pick one or the other, please, because combining the two will burn the inside of your lungs and could potentially kill you. So don't be a dumbass. But the 3-stage urine engine was probably the coolest one, even though the battery, the urine-powered battery, is a completely different concept. So I probably shouldn't have brought it up in this video. And you guys can see there's a urine-powered drug test that they have in Japan. It runs off of 1 drop of urine, and it'll process your urine while it's using your urine to find out if your urine has any drugs in it, which is also really cool. But the 3-stage urine, not any of the 3 stages are particularly powerful. The great thing about it is that you can make it so that it runs off of very little. The byproducts of some of these chemicals are unstable, but the process by which he was explaining that, well, you can take this particular gas, this chlorine gas that is coming off of this, and you can put it through this type of oil or through this type of one of the things that he had was water with I want to say aluminum powder in it. But all it does is it'll collect it and create more pressure to put into the next chamber. Now, because its first stage is a higher pressure than the next stage, and that stage is a higher pressure than the one next to it, you don't have any control valves to worry about. What you've got instead is relief valves. They're going to move at a certain amount of pressure. Like, let's say your first piston, the highest pressure that it's going to produce is about 25 pounds of pressure, which is actually still quite a bit. It's definitely enough to be dangerous. Now, once it's pushed the piston down and it releases it into the next one, well, the next one is a bigger, a bigger area. So when that chemical goes in there and it makes it do that, then what you end up doing is basically recycling that little bit of gas 3 different times. And they've actually got up to 5-stage engines like this that were built during World War II that are really cool. They weren't based on urine. But the processes by which you would use urine that way to produce different gases. The gases are dangerous, and also it's going to exhaust, which means that it's producing waste. That's why it's important to have pressure valves, and it's also important to have pressure bellows. Some of the stuff that might be produced could potentially be dangerous if it's allowed to turn into a gas, but you can fix that by having a pressure pillow that has some of the inert gases that are created that'll actually push it down to the surface of whatever the liquid is. And I'm trying to remember what the different uh, names of those are now. But urine is in itself a pretty easy compound to make a lot of different things out of. You can make both ammonia and bleach out of it. But also, ammonia is a type of bleach, which a lot of people don't know, they're not aware of. Um, so, any of you out there who had great ideas back in the day, I had a great idea of using a windmill for running a boat. Turns out there's people who have them now. Um, in a similar configuration to what I came up with in the late 80s and early 90s when I was still a kid. Then there's plastic see-through boats made out of none other than number one recycled plastics. That's this see-through plastic that's on the front of these. It's the stuff that number one recycled bottles are made out of, like this one here. This is number one polyethylene terephthalate. It reaches, or it melts down at 276 degrees Fahrenheit for Americans, or 264 degrees if it's the Russian variant, which they're so very similar that it's very difficult to tell the difference. And both of them are number one. You can mix the two and they'll mix just fine. But let's say you take this and you cut it exactly in half and turn it sideways. What do you got? You've got a boat. Some genius, back when they first started popping out a bunch of these, thought to himself, hey, you know what? You could make those bigger, and it'll last better than these kayaks are making out of plastic today, too, by the way, because they are highly reactive to the sun. That powder that you get on the top of your boat after you've kept it out there a season or two, that's going to crack through your boat. That's, well, kind of like using number two plastics. I believe this is number two. Let me see. No, it says 24. Number two is HDPE. That's high density polyethylene. That's the plastic that those other kayaks are primarily made out of. Now, if you make them out of this, it'll last 10,000 years, even if you got it in the sun. Unless it gets super hot, it'll melt. If you've got it so that it's made out of high-density polyethylene, you're talking about something that is going to stop being impact-resistant after a season, maybe two, if you leave it outside. It's something that within 2 decades of you leaving it outside, it's already broken apart down to something that is entirely impossible to use as a boat again. You would have to recast and remelt it, and you'd also have to scrape off a lot of the, what do they call that powdery shit on the outside? There is a name for it, because you've got the polymers and you've got the elastomers, and the sun dries up the elastomers and they separate their chemical bonds from the polymers, and that's what you end up with as a powder. But because the powder still has an elastomer attached to some of it, it makes really good fuels for. There's a guy who makes rocket engines out of it because he gets 30% increase out of his sugar rockets by using that, whereas if he uses iron oxide, which is literally rust, then well, he puts rust in them anyway. But he was saying that with the rust, he gets a lot more thrust, and that it also burns faster. But also, if he puts the high density polyethylene that's been treated with UV, that's how you break it down. You basically let the sun not get it hot enough to melt, but to push out any water molecules or any sort of liquids that might be in it. And also to dry up the elastomers enough that basically it's like a rubber band. But if you dry out the rubber band, it snaps. Then, if you've got two things that are attached by rubber band and it snaps in the middle, they're not attached anymore. When we start talking about dry chemicals, this is like powders and stuff. Charcoal is considered this. Obviously, if you've got a piston engine, you're not going to be wanting to push through aggregates like that. So, the great thing about the chemical engine is that you can use different types of what would be considered an aggregate just as the chemical process to change one chemical into another. The biggest issue that I see with most of this stuff is that each one of these types of engine produces a type of waste that another engine runs on. So, I mean, you're talking about a reciprocating and recycling system. Not only that, but it's going to keep on wanting to do that. It's going to keep on wanting to change the chemicals and keep on recycling itself. So you can basically have an engine that runs all the time, and it's not going to be at extremely high temperatures. It's something that you can use to power a generator, and you can use that generator to power your car. Of course, you would have to have batteries, but there's also the fact that you've got a system that is constantly charging itself. I'm not talking about free energy. It's not free energy by any measure. You still have to add fuel from time to time because you've got multiple different chemicals. You would want to make sure that you're aware of all those different chemicals and also how to read those different chemicals, how to tell if different parts of the system are cracked, and also you really do want to make sure that you've designed it and modified it so that certain reactive chemicals are not going to come in contact with one another, even in case of different parts of it breaking. But many of y'all, I'm sure, have thought of great ideas like chopping this in half the lengthways and using it as a boat. Now they have clear see-through plastic boats. Even though I came up with the idea, I'm not the only one who came up with the idea. There were probably hundreds of kids in the 1980s who thought of exactly that. 90s, sorry. There were plastic bottles in the 80s, but it was pretty much the late 80s. Before that, there were some, but it wasn't real prevalent. I mean, I remember you'd get glass bottles by the case. And I don't really remember anything that came in a plastic bottle, just plastic cups. Now, if you guys can go through and look at those, and if any of y'all are good at math, I'm constantly on the run trying to find one resource or another for my basic survival. But I think since I came up with the idea of a raft, an inflatable raft tent, and now they have it, and I came up with a see-through plastic boat, and now they have it, and many other ideas. With this one, as long as I don't tell you the chemicals, you guys can go through and you can figure it out for yourselves. Just remember that some of the chemical names get very confusing, which is why I had to go back and look them up and listen to the video again, because sometimes there's like different type of nitrites and nitrates, different stuff that's attached to potassium, and different stuff that attaches to sodium. And I wanted to make sure I wasn't completely stupid before making this video, but I also know that in my state of mind, being overwhelmed and all that, it's not likely that I would remember all the chemicals. You go through and look it up instead of taking my word for it, then if you screw it up, it's on you. Although if you pay attention, you will probably figure out what order to do it in. Be safe in this video. I'm wasting a lot of battery that I don't really have to waste.